Welcome to Downpour.com's interview series. I'm Grover Gardner, and today it's my pleasure to be speaking with Brené Brown. Brené is a research professor at the University of Houston Graduate College of Social Work. She is the author of The Gifts of Imperfection and I Thought It Was Just Me, But It Isn't. Her latest book is Daring Greatly: How the Courage to be Vulnerable Transforms the Way We Live, Love, Parent, and Lead, which is a One Spirit Book Club selection. Brené is also a nationally renowned speaker and has received numerous teaching awards, including the college's Outstanding Faculty Award. Her work has appeared in The Washington Post, Psychology Today, and has been featured on NPR, PBS, and CNN. Blackstone Audio is publishing the audio version of Daring Greatly, narrated by Karen White, simultaneously with the hardcover on September 11th, 2012. Welcome, Brené. Thank you for joining us today.
I'm excited to be here with you.
Before we get to the new book, I want to talk a little bit about just a little bit of general background on your work. We know the shelves are groaning with self-help books, confidence building, doggone it, I'm a nice guy and people like me, and that sort of superficial approach. But your work is very different from that, much more profound. Your research into issues of shame and vulnerability. Could you tell us just a little bit about how your approach differs from the sort of topical, think positive sort of thing?
I had really no intention of having a career that looked anything like this. As a young doctoral student, I was really interested in understanding the anatomy of connection. I have a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in social work, and I was getting my PhD. And the one thing that I've learned from all of that education is that connection is why we're here. We're neurobiologically hardwired for it, which is not something that we talked about then when I was in school, but certainly something that we have. We have a lot of data to support that idea now. We're hardwired for connection. It's what gives purpose and meaning to our lives. And the thing that I was really interested in understanding is, what is the anatomy of connection? I mean, it's such a gauzy word. It's really hard to get our hands and our head around it. And so I started off I'm a qualitative researcher, so I started off doing some interviewing around connection and asking people, tell me about the most important relationships in your life. Tell me about the most valuable connections that you feel with different people. And as humans often do, people described connection to me by telling me their stories of disconnection and heartbreak. And very quickly in that process, really a matter of a couple of months, I ran into this thing that kind of violently unraveled connection between people. And it turned out to be shame. And I was very interested in this topic because it was so powerful that I couldn't believe, having 3 degrees and being a mental health professional, I'd never really studied it or read about it. And so I spent 6 years studying shame and fear and scarcity and what are the messages and expectations that fuel this feeling that we're not enough, that we're not good enough, rich enough, beautiful enough, powerful enough. And then year 7, I kind of turned everything on its head and said, okay, I get how shame works. I've written a book. I put a theory into the academic literature. What about all these people I've interviewed over the last 6 years who, man, they wake up in the morning in the same world I wake up in, but rather than the litany of not enough, they're like, you know what? I'm imperfect. I screw things up. Things are messy right now, but I'm enough. So I called them the wholehearted. And I spent the next several years asking that question: what does it take to live in love with our whole hearts? And the answer was twofold. The biggest 2 things were engaging with the world from a place of worthiness, really staring down shame and understanding how it operates in our lives. And the second piece was engaging with vulnerability. Wholehearted men and women embrace and accept and engage with vulnerability, where I think the rest of us run like the wind from it. At least I do, or I did. I mean, I know until I really not only did the research, but then started to apply it in my own life, that I had spent most of my life, like many people, trying to outrun and outsmart vulnerability, trying to stay ahead of uncertainty and risk and emotional exposure. And so that's kind of what led me to Daring Greatly.
Where does this come from? Biologically, aren't we supposed to be whole? Where does all this shame crop up in our lives?
It's a good question. I mean, I think it comes from a lot of different places. I think a great way to think about shame to me is prerequisites for worthiness. If I took the men and women I've interviewed over the last dozen years and divided them crudely into two groups, people who have a strong sense of love and belonging, which I would argue is an irreducible need of men, women, and children, that we have a sense of love and belonging. If you took that group and then you took another group of people, which would be the larger group, and that's the group of people who struggle for a sense of love and belonging. They struggle to believe they're deeply lovable. They struggle to feel like they belong. The only variable that really was different between these two groups is the people who have a sense of love and belonging believe they're worthy of love and belonging. That's it. This made me crazy. It actually pissed me off a little bit because I thought, what does that mean? How do you get to a place where you believe you're worthy of love and belonging? And I thought, maybe these are the people whose lives have turned out really beautifully. But as it turns out, it's not the case. These were not folks that had fewer divorces or histories of trauma or addiction or bankruptcies. They're just people who, in the midst of struggle, believed they were still worthy of love and belonging. And so when you ask, where does this shame come from? I think from our families of origin forward, we get these kind of subtle and sometimes not so subtle messages about, well, you'll be more worthy of love and belonging if or when, if you make partner, when you lose 10 pounds, if your husband doesn't leave, if you stay sober, when your daughter gets into Stanford, like these really subtle ideas that our worthiness is not inherent. And so that's where I think shame comes from. And we have lots of them. And I think, again, the majority of them probably, they always say that I have a therapist who's a good friend who says, our family pushes our buttons the best because they're the ones who set them. I think is so true. I think a lot of it comes from families of origin, but I think also you turn on the TV. I've never been a parent and not been a shame researcher. So I spend a lot of time talking to my kids about body image and critical awareness and privilege and entitlement and gratitude and the things that I think make a difference. But I often tell parents to safeguard your children from the media by turning off the television is like trying to protect them from air pollution by asking them not to breathe.
Right.
So I think it starts in families, but we have a culture that's very pervasive around perfection.
So we have to recognize this and, in a sense, be proactive in our families and raising our children. And we can't ignore it.
No. And I think that's part of the last chapter in Daring Greatly is about wholehearted parenting. I said earlier that love and belonging are irreducible needs of men, women, and children. And I believe that with every fiber of my being. I mean, not just my heart, but intellectually, as a researcher, there's no question in my mind that that's true. And so when I talked to groups of kids, high schoolers, junior high kids about, and I always ask them this question, what do you think is the difference between fitting in and belonging? And it's an interesting question that I'd never thought of, but it emerged as very important in my data because as it turns out, the biggest barrier to belonging is fitting in. Fitting in is about assessing a situation and acclimating. Belonging is about showing up and letting yourself be seen. And so when I asked kids what the difference was, I just was curious if they had a grip on that. Of course, they immediately knew what the difference was. They'd say things like, fitting in is wanting to be with people you want to be with. Belonging is being with the people who want you. And one of the things that I heard over and over from teens and tweens is they would say to me, not belonging at school is really hard, but nothing is as painful as not belonging at home.
Oh.
And so when you say to me, we have to have an awareness and awakening around these issues, we have to do something with our families, we have to have conversations about belonging and shame and vulnerability with our kids.
Is this an American syndrome, Western syndrome? Is this worldwide?
I think it's a good question. We don't have very many cross-cultural shame studies just because there's a lot of language issues, which I see all the time because I work with translators. When the book gets published in other countries, translators will call me and they're like, oh God, these words are tough. And we've got 20 words for shame. And
Right.
English interestingly has one, but this is not an American phenomenon. The TED Talk, the TEDx Houston talk on vulnerability has been translated into like 40 languages. This is about being human.
Presumably, people have been dealing with this for centuries. Why is it important now?
One, I think it's more pervasive now. Daring Greatly, the title of the book is based off this quote from Theodore Roosevelt, often called the man in the arena quote or citizen in a republic speech, where he says it's not the critic who counts. It's not the man who points as the strong man stumbles. The credit goes to the man who's actually in the arena, fighting, coming up short again and again. I'm paraphrasing, because whether he wins or loses, whether he's valiant or he fails, he's in there trying and he's daring greatly. And the question becomes, in this culture today, which is so critical, I call it projectile criticism and reflexive. If you've ever raised a toddler, you know exactly what that looks like. Projectile criticism, reflexive cynicism. It's so hard to walk into that arena and say, I'm going to give this a shot. I'm going to put this idea on the table at work. I'm going to tell this person I love them. I'm going to say it first. I'm going to send my child to school and get excited for them because they're trying out for first chair in the band when I know that that's probably not going to happen. But I'm going to dare greatly and I'm going to walk in the arena. That is so hard in this culture today because we are so cynical and so critical that we may have always struggled with vulnerability and we may have always struggled with shame. But this is the first time in my life as a researcher, and I started this ironically right before September 11th. So I've seen a huge change in the zeitgeist around fear and fear of being vulnerable and uncertainty. This is the first time ever where I think that we have forgotten that the heart of courage is vulnerability. I challenge people to give me an example of moral courage, of leadership, of something exciting in the classroom that's not born of vulnerability.
What is authentic leadership? What does that mean? I see the term, but what's behind that?
Well, I think to me, I'm very specific in my work around leadership. And I define a leader as anyone who holds him or herself responsible and accountable for finding the potential in people and processes. I don't think leadership or leaders, I don't think there's any correlation between being a leader and the number of direct reports you have. I have talked with CEOs who in no way, shape, or form, in my opinion, are leaders, are leading. And I've talked to frontline people who are some of the strongest leaders I've ever seen. So to me, authentic leadership is about the willingness to be vulnerable, to be imperfect, to set boundaries, and the willingness to have the courage to try things without guarantees. I mean, I define vulnerability as uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. And so to me, someone who can find the potential in people and processes in the midst of uncertainty and risk and exposure, that's authentic leadership to me.
Your talks and your books seem to resonate with women, but it's not just about women.
No, I think probably my readers and the viewers of the TED Talks are probably 50-50 now. And I think that was very purposeful with Daring Greatly because, and I write, and it's the first place I write about my research on men and shame. It's the first place I write about things from both sides and both perspectives. And early in my career, when I first started studying shame, I didn't study both men and women. I just studied women because there was a lot of controversy and debate in the literature about how men and women experience shame. Do they experience the same way? Are women more susceptible or men more susceptible? And so in the last 5 years, I've focused a lot on men and their experiences. And so this is for all of us.
So Daring Greatly, the new book, how having the courage to be vulnerable and how this transforms the way we live, love, parent, and lead. This is kind of summarizing, bringing us up to date on this vulnerability issue and the shame issue.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm really excited. It's really, I think this is the heart of my work. This is the big stuff. And it seems to be like, I think the book is a rollicking adventure from everything from, very personal, intimate. There's some parts on there on intimacy and vulnerability and sex and body image to what's happening in leadership in schools and corporations to parenting. And it's, I think, In the beginning, the publishers thought, well, maybe we'll do a book for everyone, a book on leadership, a book on men, a book on women, a book on parenting, schools. And I thought, no, because the lessons are the same. And we're whole people and we have multiple roles in our lives. I mean, I'm a mother, I'm a wife, I'm a professor, I'm a researcher, I'm a sister, daughter, friend. Vulnerability is a full body experience, a full contact sport. And so I think the best way to do it is just to sit down with this and talk about how this works itself through our lives and how it shows up in every part of our life.
Well, I could go on all day. This is fascinating. We probably should leave something for the book. So I'll let you go and thank you for, I can't imagine a better lead-in for wanting to explore the new book and also your previous work. So I really appreciate your talking with us today.
Thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to the collaboration.
Yes, thanks. Thank you for joining us for this exclusive interview with Brené Brown. You can find Daring Greatly and all of Blackstone Audio's titles at downpour.com.